All right, you guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. First and foremost, thank you guys for attending The Cost of Loss, Supporting Injured Student Athletes by Collette Toney. If you want to use the subtitle feature, the transcript feature, it is available. And when it comes to questions, if you guys have any throughout the presentation, you can always drop them in the chat. And when we get to the end of the presentation, we'll address the questions. But without further ado, I will turn it on over to Collette for you guys.
Hi, everyone. I'm Collette Toney, and I work at the University of Georgia. I'm the Associate Director of Academic Services, and I'm a learning specialist as well. A little bit about me is I worked at Ohio State previously. I worked at Georgia first, and I was at Ohio State as a learning specialist too, and I studied education and taught middle school for a couple of years. So I love education. I love being a learning specialist. And I think that you'll see throughout this presentation, the reason that I wanted to do this study and the strategies that I think that we all can use to help support our student athletes that deal with an injury. So for our study today, we're going to be looking at the purpose of why I even wanted to do this study in the first place. I just finished my doctorate degree last year, and what belonging is, the title is Sense of Belonging and the Injured Student Athlete. And I think it's important for all of us to understand what belonging is, how it refers to our students, how it refers to us, and how we can continue to help them push through in those times that they are injured. Scholarly support. The participants that I chose, I got to interview 6 really amazing student athletes from various sports and various institutions. So I'm really excited to share their story. I just want to emphasize that my research, though based in literature, is a lot based on their stories, their quotes, their experiences. So if it ever seems like I'm just stating something, it's because it was said from their eyes and their perspective. So I just want to definitely emphasize that the importance of storytelling, and this is really important. The findings and the implications. So what I got out of those interviews, what I got out of that research, and how does that imply our work that we do? In whatever area it is, I think that I'll be able to touch on the different types of things and strategies we can do to help support injured student athletes. And at the end, I would love to just have a discussion with you all to discuss how you all dealt with injured student athletes, what your personal experience was. I've done this presentation one other time, and a lot of people who were former student athletes also had that experience. So I would love for all of us to just discuss, have a great conversation, and be able to really leave out of here with 1 or 2 strategies that we can use to help support injured student athletes. The purpose of my study was to examine the experience of injured student athletes as it relates to the central tenets of sense of belonging and mattering. Like I said earlier, I'm a learning specialist, and so I've been able to build really great relationships with my student athletes. I spend a lot of time with them. Here at Georgia, I have various sports, but anyone who's on the call who's a learning specialist knows the amount of time that you have with your students. And so I unfortunately have had a good number of students deal with injuries in various sports, and you just hear the conversations, you hear their confusion on what to do, their confusion on rehab, what the future looks like. And so being a part of those conversations, that I was definitely glad that they trusted me with it, made me want to study what that experience was like. Of course, like I said, in my experiences at a couple of institutions, I know what their personal experience was like, but I think the one thing about research is, how is this going on in other areas? How are other student athletes feeling about this same thing, depending on the sport, depending on the institution, depending on the type of competition of that sport, the status of the student athlete. So I really wanted to just look into what this experience was like for a various amount of different student athletes. So that was the purpose. That's like my background a little bit on why I wanted to study it. And I was very pleased with the conversations that I was able to have, that I'll be able to share with you all too. The research question that guided my entire my dissertation was, how does the experience of being injured affect the student athlete's sense of belonging? So for a little bit, I'm going to break down what sense of belonging is, and it's based off of Terrell Strayhorn's work on what sense of belonging is. And it really refers to all students that are going into college, all college students, and how does it change over time. But I'll discuss his model, and then I'll give us a little chance to see what that means for us and how we can identify belonging in our own lives before we get into the research. So for Strayhorn, sense of belonging is based on a different amount of tenets. So it's a basic human need. Belonging is something that all humans need to just feel connected to their peers, feel connected to their community. And it's a basic human need. When I show you the model, it's like on the middle ground of the things that we need to just continue to succeed as people. It's a fundamental motive, and it's sufficient enough to drive behavior. So if you want to belong to something or some group and you see that they're displaying these type of characteristics, belonging is important enough for us to also display those characteristics, for us to also dress a certain way or listen to a certain type of music or go to a certain type of place. Belonging is important enough for all of us it drives our human behavior. It takes on heightened importance in different contexts. So let's say that you're moving to a new school. Belonging is gonna change based on where you are in that context, whether you were at a new job, all that is gonna change. At certain times, belonging may be more important to you at certain times of your life than others, and among certain populations. So whether you're moving towards identity groups or whether you're moving towards other type of identities, it's going to take on heightened importance in those different areas. It's related to and a consequence of mattering. So how much do we matter? Do we matter? Who do we matter to? That type of stuff is really important to belonging. Social identities intersect and affect college students' sense of belonging. So depending on the type of identities you feel, they all are going to intersect on how you feel like you belong. A lot of his research was on Black male students that were at predominantly white institutions. So again, the way those social identities intersect affects how they belong in that institution. So when you're thinking about yourself, think about all the different social identities that you hold and how that can affect your belonging in different areas. It makes positive outcomes when you feel like you belong, and I'll share this a little bit later. When you feel that you belong, you feel important, you feel like you want to have a positive impact on people, you are more driven to be successful in whatever it is, whether it's school, whether it's your job. Belonging yields positive outcomes, and it must be satisfied on a continual basis, and it changes as circumstances change, as conditions change, and as life honestly changes. So it is something that you can't just belong one day and you feel like that's going to satisfy you for the rest of the year. It's something that needs to be satisfied on a continual basis throughout different seasons of your life. So I'm going to share the two models that he has developed over time. This was when he first came. It's a little bit blurry because I got it from the textbook because I wanted to pull it exactly from there. This was his first model when he first came with the theory of belonging, and it's changed more recently in 2018 and more to this model. And so again, love and belongingness is in the middle of those needs that we need as humans. So after safety and security, we want to feel like that we belong, and that has an impact on our esteem and our self-actualization. So in the research, we see that when you belong, it's going to have great impact on our academic achievement and student athletes' academic achievement. They persist more and they retain more in their institutions. When they feel a greater sense of belonging, they're going to overall enjoy their experience in college. And it's critical to the success of all students, especially our student athletes, but all students that come into college, feeling like they belong at that institution. And it doesn't even have to be, let's say, for example, at UGA, it doesn't have to feel like you belong at UGA, but if you have a great connection with the people in your dorm, if you have a great connection with a club, that's going to matter on how you feel like you belong to the institution as a whole. A lack of sense of belonging can make a student feel isolated. alienated, lonely, and invisible. And when they do not feel like they belong, it makes students want to leave their institution or their education in total. So it's really important. Belonging is something that we all are experiencing in different ways, but especially for our students at a time that's such important as college, it's really important for them to feel like they have a sense of belonging. And why does this matter for us? It's our institutional responsibility. When students come to any of our colleges or universities, we have a responsibility that they are in our care. We have a responsibility to build them up holistically as students. And when you're considering your mission of whether it's your institution, your department, your branch in your department, it's really important to stay mission driven about helping our students belong. So if it's something that you have in your mission of you want to build students to be this type of citizen, you want to build students to be able to be engaged and responsible, that it also shows that we also want to help our students belong. And it's our duty of care as educators as well. So while we're talking about belonging and I'm reflecting on your identities, I wanted you all to put in the chat just 1 to 3 areas where you belong in your personal life, whether that's your family, your job, a club that you're involved in, a group or organization that you're involved in. If you could just put it in the chat so that I can get a sense of how we feel about belonging and how we understand belonging for ourselves. I'm looking at the answers. I see a lot of family, a lot of friends, a lot of work, different identities. I would say personally for myself, the areas that I feel like I belong are in my profession, with my family, and with my small group of friends at church as well. So those are just some areas that we feel like we belong. And if you think about those and think about different things that have happened in those areas of your life, if things happen in family, if things happen at work, you know that your sense of belonging changes over time, and it can change in different contexts, whether you're promoted or you took another job or you went to another department. We know that belonging can shift depending on those things. So thank you all for putting those answers in the chat. When we get into our student athletes and what does belonging mean to them, we know that sense of belonging can be fostered by the environment, so whatever environment that they are in. But what's really important for our student athletes is their identity. When I was doing my research before I conducted the interviews, a lot of that was repeated a lot in research is the student athletes that have a higher sense of identity as an athlete, it becomes who they are, not what they do. They see themselves as the basketball player. They see themselves as the baseball player and not a person who plays baseball. So that matters a lot when we're working to see what type of identity and how salient is to certain students. We see that athletic status becomes a real big part of their identity. Belonging to a team can give student athletes a sense of community. For any of us who have been a part of a team, whether it was, a Pee Wee League or middle school or high school, you know that it just gives you this sense of belonging of being a part of that team, and even more so for our college student athletes. And the higher athletic identity, the more unlikely that student athletes will explore connection in other areas. So as I shared before, if they see themselves as the baseball player, that gives that student a less likely chance to look at who they are as a student, to look at who they are as a person in their hallway. Just, it gives them a sense of only looking at themselves in one type of lens and not others. So that's going to come up a little bit more for those student athletes that have this high sense of student athletic identity and they become injured, how that can make things a lot more difficult for them. Athletics as a subculture, for all of us who work in it, we know depending on where your physical location is on campus, or even how you all feel about sports on your campus, you might feel like it's a subculture. I know at Georgia, we're kind of off on the side of our campus, and so it feels like a little community. It feels like a little part of campus itself. So athletics can be a subculture in that way. And the experience of the student athlete definitely varies of a non-student athlete because they feel like they are a part of a specific type of culture on campus. And identifying with their team gives them a sense of community, a sense of belonging. And research shows it's obviously because of the time that they spend together, whether that's through practices, competitions, weights, they're waking up in the morning to do things, they're traveling together on the road. And so they get a large sense of belonging and community from being a part of their team. When student athletes are injured, they may feel anger, frustration, and isolation due to their injury. It can cause anxiety, depression, and ill performance in other areas. When I share for my participants, the one area that we saw that student athletes struggled with the most was academics once they were injured. Coaches were not as aware of the hardship of the student athlete's particular injuries. When I was reading through research, a lot of it was that the student athlete didn't want to share and be as transparent with certain coaches. So depending on the sport, they wanted to downplay how injured they were or how long they were going to be out of play because they wanted to make sure that their coach was still invested in their athletic journey. So the coaches were not as aware, just simply were not as aware of some of those hardships. And teammates, from research, teammates often move on from an injury. When a student athlete is injured, they might feel more focused at that time to support them, but the weeks go by, the months go by, matches or games go by, and the teammates kind of move on from the injury. Not that they forget their teammate, but they just kind of move on because things are continuing to go on through the season. And a lot that we saw too is they help the student athletes that are injured adapt to a new role. So a lot of times they might feel like they are coaches now. A lot of times they might feel like they're giving more advice now. And so the teammates kind of adapt to that injured student athlete having a new role. So particularly for my study, I went through N4A to find the participants. I wanted about 6 to 8 so I could really interview them. I did narrative inquiry and a semi-structured interview. So I focused all on their stories. Narrative inquiry, the big part is getting their story. So at the time when I was doing these interviews, it was the latter part of 2020. And so I knew I was going to be sitting with the student athletes on Zoom at the time for 45 minutes to an hour, just really getting their story. And those that were represented in my story are football. There was a couple of track and field student athletes, baseball, and cheerleading. So I was really excited that I got to have a larger range. The institutions also varied. We had mostly Division I student athletes, but we did have a Division II student athlete in the study as well. And I'm going to share their quotes and a little bit about each participant before getting into what themes that were drawn out from the study and the implications for us as a staff. So Lionel, his quote that stuck out to me, and I picked all these quotes because they were just something that struck me while they were sharing their stories. I spent a lot of time reading their stories and getting the themes out. So these are the quotes that stuck out to me, and I'll give you all a chance to read them yourselves. So I will start with Lionel. He was a baseball player, and his quote reads, "To see the light at the end of the tunnel, I think can be a challenge." He was someone who got hurt multiple times throughout his season, or multiple times throughout his years. And he came back from injury too quickly, in his opinion. He was so excited to get back with his team that when he was injured, he shared that, he didn't love not traveling. He would just miss them. He wasn't a part of the team as he felt. And so he felt like he rushed himself to get back into play so that he could be back part of the team. And it was something that he was just said, there was a part in the story that he was standing at the bat and he said the pitch came by so quickly that he knew he wasn't ready. He was just, I can't do this. Like, this is too much for me. And he shouted out his training staff and his coaches that really helped him through the process. And he was someone who was really just, without his coach, without his training staff, he said that he doesn't think that he'd be able to deal with some of the feelings that he was feeling throughout that injury. Penelope was a track and field student, and her quote is, "And obviously when I got hurt, I can honestly say I was lost. I was really lost. And I know for a fact I was at the lowest part of my life." She dealt with, in her words, mismanagement of her injury. She was not sure who to go to, when the surgery was, what was going on with her knee. And it was just really difficult for her because she just felt like she couldn't get the full story from anyone. In her own words, physical movements around campus for her in particular was near impossible. Her mom came and stayed with her for a long period of time, and academics were very difficult for her. She ended up transferring, and she still, at the time of the interview, was still dealing with the effects of the injury because there were still multiple surgeries to come, but she ended up going to graduate school. And so she was really excited about that at the time. But it just goes to show you that injuries are not just something that affects just a moment in time. It could be something that affects them for years or forever. So even though she was done with track and field, it was something she was still having to deal with while she was in graduate school. Sloan's quote was, "My biggest fear came true." She was a cheerleader, and she talked mostly about the mental blocks of performing certain flips and performing certain stunts. And she had a really hard time because she felt like people moved on from her injury a lot faster than she did. She still struggled to continue with cheerleading, but her teammates would encourage her, but she also felt like they were kind of rushing past her injury. And she found a lot of connections outside of her sport. And this is something that we're going to talk about later, that those connections really helped her continue to deal with the effects of her injury. And she actually is still involved in college athletics today. Mind you, all of the names, they are not their real names. I just want to, just in case you're like, wow, she's just giving their whole story. But those are the names that I chose for them throughout the study. And those are the first three. I'll give you a second to read these on your own. So Raylene was also a track and field student athlete. She had an injury during the season, and she was so focused on competing that she shared that she spent holidays away from her family so she could rehab at her school. It was really important for her to get back from her injury. And so again, it goes to show the sacrifice that some student athletes are taking after they're injured just to continue with their sport. She ended up transferring as well, and she shared that she felt that she was kind of pushed out because the team needed her scholarship. And so again, you're dealing with the emotions of an injury and also dealing with being disconnected from your team in that way. She's still currently pursuing a professional career in track, but I thought that when her quote of, "When they found out I was injured, they just focused on themselves," was really telling, because again, she felt like just people were just moving on, and that people were focusing on their own seasons and their own talents in the sport. And so she kind of felt isolated during that time. Miles's quote was, "Your injuries are really small in that kind of world." He was a Division I football player of a playoff contention team, and felt, again, in his words, he felt that the minor injuries were no reason to miss practice. They were something that you just have to push through. There's something that comes with the game. And especially with the type of season they were having when this injury occurred, he felt like those injuries just, he didn't have time for him. So he just wanted to continue to push through, and they ended up getting worse and worse and worse. And playing through the injury ended up resulting in surgery. And so again, this shows some student athletes, when they're having a great season, or they have the hopes of a championship, or they have the hopes of playoffs, whatever sport it is, how they might treat their own bodies, just hoping that they can help contribute to a successful season. Isaac was a Division I football player as well. And his quote was, "I just didn't want to really be there anymore. I just didn't want to be around the facility like that." He could no longer play football. He had broken his neck during the game. And so his quote to me shared how he felt about the physical facilities of where he spent the majority of his time. He didn't want to be there anymore because he felt like he wasn't connected to the team anymore. And when he was around the facility, he shared that just reminded him of what happened to him. And so it was really important, again, that something that was so important to why he went to the institution changed overnight, and allowed him to really just be confused on whether he wanted to be around his teammates or whether he didn't. He also got connected with another group. He joined a fraternity. He found connection elsewhere. And I think that his story was really interesting because he just dealt with the confusion of, I'm relieved that I'm not having the pressure of playing football, but I'm also sad about not being able to play football. And again, it goes to show you during that age, that time, and that age of development, it can be really confusing to try to decipher through all these emotions while injured. At the end of each interview, I asked each participant, what did they wish that we knew for working with an injured student athlete? What is something that they wanted to know? And as we read these and go through these, when you're thinking, I know when I was writing my dissertation, I was thinking, oh, I've always, I did know that. I do know that injuries add more to their plate. But I think it's important is that they must have felt that the people around them did not know these things or did not show those things. So what they wished we knew, even if we personally do know them or understand them to be true, the participants didn't feel that those around them knew these things. So just wanted to preface that. Injuries adding more to their plate. Some of the participants shared that other people thought they just had more time. Now that they were not playing their sport, they had more time for academics, they had more time to go to class, they had more time to, do all these things, but they felt like it just added a lot more to their plate because they were dealing with the emotions of it, the rehab of their injuries, and just having a lot on their mental space. People forget is that we're still young versions of ourselves that had a huge dream. To get there and lose it, it's devastating, and they don't see the tears at night. One of the participants had shared that and just said, you don't necessarily see all the emotions that go on with someone being injured. This is their dream to play whatever sport it is in college, and to lose it or even to lose a time of it was really devastating. They shared it could be just a dark place, and being aware of their mindset is really important. Each student athlete that is injured is going to have a different mindset, but just being aware of it is truly important. Through the themes of the interviews, we saw that athletic identity was one of the most telling signs of how a student athlete felt about their injury. It affects college choice, where they choose to continue to play their sport, belonging with their team. If they had a high sense of athletic identity and it was really salient to them, it's going to affect how they feel like they belong to their team. With the student athlete who might be, for example, a starter, they might feel a higher sense of belonging than a student who might have walked on, and the response to their injury. Those that had a very high athletic identity and had an injury of time loss, or they couldn't play their sport anymore, it really affected how they responded to that injury. Those that saw that they were going to be out for a month or two looked at it a lot differently than those that were looking at getting drafted or looking at playing professionally, and the injury set them back a year or so. So their athletic identity definitely just really affected how they responded to the injury. Belonging with the team, there was a lot of isolation after the injury, and not every participant shared that that isolation was intentional. So they just felt isolated themselves, that they weren't traveling, they weren't a part of practices, they weren't a part of some of the things that the team was a part of. I know the student that was a cheerleader that shared her story was that she just couldn't go to certain things because she had a concussion, and because of, if it was a concert and the team was going, and if it was a game and they were going, there were certain things she couldn't go to with her team. So she felt very isolated after that injury. Role change, all participants experience a role change from being an active player to something different. A lot of that time was coaches. A lot of the participants took on more of a coaching role with their teammates and giving them advice and giving them encouragement, and really just being a different type of role than they were used to. And each one also shared about the pressures that they felt, whether it's from teammates, whether it's from coaches, whether it's from trainers, of just getting through their injury. I think some of the teammates that thought they were being encouraging to the participants, they felt that they were being pressured to hurry up and get back to play so that we can have you, and hurry up and get back so that you can be a part of this. So a lot of them felt that pressures from others. And social support was one of the most important things that helped and encourage injured student athletes. They all shared how important their family was during that time. 2 moms I know from the participants came and physically stayed in the college campus or in the college town that they were at to help the student athlete while they were injured. And groups outside of the team, this is again going back to identity. A lot of the participants, once they were injured, found connections in other identities, whether that was a fraternity, whether that was FCA, whether that was being a part of their residence hall group and organization and government, I guess, per se, of leadership, that they really started connecting with their other identities and really exploring those while they were injured from their team. So for us, what does this mean? How do we continue to help injured student athletes feel like they belong, and how do we continue to support them? So again, just to reiterate that the athletic identity has changed, it's shifted, they experience a loss of belonging, and it affects how they respond to injury. Belonging with the team was often strong pre-injury, but it changed after the injury as participants experience their role changes and whatnot. And social support from family and non-athletically related members were integral. And I point out the not necessarily they don't work in athletics, but the ones that were not just with their team. So a lot of the participants mentioned their academic supports, their academic counselors, tutors, that they felt like just talking with them that was not related to sports was really helpful for supporting and encouraging them. So implications for our different areas that I saw for coaches, just acknowledging the role change that the student athlete may feel after they're injured, encouraging them to take on more of an encouragement role or take on of a coaching role, giving advice to a first-year student or giving advice to someone in the same position on the same team was really important. Listening support, so just hearing the student athlete out that is injured. How do they feel? What's going on, and just being sure that they're being active in that listening instead of just pushing them through and saying, hey, we're excited to get you back. It was really important for them to feel like their coaches were listening and really hearing how they were feeling. Check-in meetings were really important when we discussed it with the participants, just checking in with them. And this might sound very simple, but it was something that was very transformational for them, was to feel like someone was checking in on them during this process and seeing how outside of just how they're healing, but how are they feeling in all of their other areas of being a student athlete. And transferring was something that came up from a couple of the participants, that once they were transferring and they were injured, they were very confused on who had the right information, who to get that information to. So that's just something that for implications for coaches is something to keep in mind. For the teammates, and this is us working with other student athletes of injured student athletes, just helping the teammates and helping them embrace the feedback from the injured student athlete. We had talked a little bit when I was asking them about strategies about having a speaker series of having student athletes come in that have dealt with that same injury or have dealt with an injury before, and how that could help teammates learn how to support and encourage each other. And just teammate to teammate support, being there, making it realize that it's not just about you being on the same team, it's that you care about this student, you care about your friend, and how to support them. For athletic staff, such as ourselves, listening, again, very vital, very important, hearing them out. Holistic development, this is really important in areas outside of athletics as well, academic, career development, personal development, just helping student athletes before they're injured explore what other identities matter to them, and not the ones that we want to assign, but the ones that truly matter to them, and helping them see the different types of connections they could have on their campuses that are outside of just their athletic identity, and engaging in other identities, as I said, whether that's something joining an organization, going for an internship, other clubs on campus, just really helping them engage in the ones that they feel more salient at the time. So recommendations for our staff, athletic staff, is to validate their feelings. One of the participants mentioned that people would say, oh, it could have been worse, or you're lucky it wasn't this, and you're lucky to get back. And just, they wanted validation. They wanted to feel how they felt, and they just wanted to just people to understand that they're injured, they're having an emotional reaction to it, and it's okay to not feel the best about this situation. So just, they did not love when people were just kind of shying away from their injury or just making it seem it could have been something worse. So you should be grateful. You should be glad it wasn't. Did not feel like validation for them. Advocating for injured student athletes, whether that means that they need a different ride to class, whether that means they need to talk to their professor about something different for class. I know Zoom is something really popular right now. I'm not sure about your campuses, but I know that a lot of people have shied away from just using Zoom, but advocating for that student athlete and helping them advocate for themselves. If it's a physical injury that's more difficult to get around on campus, or just even painful to get around on campus, just helping them advocate for themselves in those spaces. Encouraging connections through diverse areas and their identity. So again, as I shared before, that was something that was a game changer that happened a lot of times towards the end of their injury or towards the end of their experience dealing with their team, that they were getting connected to other areas on campus. And I think it's important for us, if we know that now, helping student athletes connect before something happens is really important. And emphasizing the collaboration of academic and athletic staff. I recommended this from my study because once we talk to each other, we'd all know when we collaborate, we're better, we're stronger. And so when the coaches are talking to the academic staff is talking to their support staff that works with them, whether it's tutors or whatnot. When you all are talking about what's going on with the student athlete, you can get a better picture and be able to develop better support for that student. So especially as we saw, what injured student athlete is definitely at risk for a lot of different emotional reactions, that it's important to have that collaboration so that we can all know what's going on so that we can better support. And I would also note here, family too, just discussing this with their family, because we saw that family was a big part of their social support during an injury. So making sure you're all on the same page, you all are understanding how to support that student athlete is really important. I pointed out different areas for research for after my study. I think it's really important to look at the type of injury of a student athlete because that's going to affect how they're going to respond to it. The status of a student athlete, I've seen personally as a learning specialist, student athletes that were going to be first round picks that dealt with an injury and how they struggled to that compared to a student athlete who was going to end their sport their senior year in college. So how they each respond to that injury is going to matter, and it's going to affect them a lot differently. The saliency of athletic identity, we've talked about more, but I thought it was even, if we could get more into research to understand what a salient athletic identity and how they respond to injury would be important. Treatment and transferring, again, came up a couple of times with my participants that they were just confused on the treatment. They were confused about their injury. They didn't feel like they got the whole story of their injury or what to do. Pressures of coaches handling injury, because we know with the transfer portal, NIL, all these different things, that there's a certain pressure that might be unnamed or even unresearched as much as it could, that pushes certain coaches to push a student athlete through an injury. And again, that's based on from the stories that they were sharing and not my opinion on the dealings. And then pressures of trainers handling injury as well, because again, participants shared that they felt pressured, but that pressure might have been passed down from others. And so just looking into what that research looks like, I think would be great for our field. If anyone's on the call who's studying and they're in their doctoral program, I definitely suggest something in these areas could be really beneficial to the body of work that we're all developing for our student athletes, and just the research in general for our field. I think is important for us to gauge this type of support to continue to help injured student athletes. And lastly, how we support, encourage, listen, and discuss with student athletes during their injury is integral to their belonging, persistence, and overall well-being in college. We see that belonging is important. We see that it's a human need, and we see that it drives very positive factors. And when student athletes are injured, they're at a risk of losing that sense of belonging. So once they're injured, we already know that they are at that risk. And so we have to make sure that we're listening, we're encouraging, we're helping them connect, we're helping explore other identities, because we know that that's integral into their persistence at your university or college and their overall well-being as a student athlete. So in the chat, before we open it up for discussion and questions, I want to get, what is one way you can support injured student athletes in your current role, whether that's something that we shared, that I shared in the presentation, or something that you're thinking about. What is one way in your current role, intern, learning specialist, academic counselor, athletic staff, what's one way that you can, in your current role, support injured student athletes? If you could put it in the chat. I know if I'm looking at the answers come in, and I know that for me personally, in my current role as a learning specialist, I think it's important to listen. It's important to also connect. Like, I feel like it's important for them to connect with other staff that might have more experience, especially if you start seeing certain types of anxiety or signs of depression, connecting them out. I am not the end all be all. No, if another learning specialist on the call, you might feel like you have to be everything, but we're not everything. And so it's really important to connect them to the professionals that have that experience, that have those resources that can help in those ways. So I know that's one way that I can support, is by listening, but also by identifying when I need to report out and get them some other type of support from another staff member or professional in the area. Okay, well, I want to definitely open it up for questions. I want to leave some time for questions and to also do the session evaluation and the conference evaluation at the end. So you can put a question in the chat and we will go over them with that. Or comments. Any questions? If it's particular about my research too, I would be glad to answer.
Looks like we got a couple. How can academics share this message with other support staff members?
Thanks, Levy. I would say that academics can share this message by first making sure that they're trained and well-versed in what this looks like. I think working in academics myself, I can say when a student athlete is injured, some people have this thought of, oh, well, they can just spend all their time over here and working, doing study guides and getting their grades up. And I think it's important to understand the emotional reaction that they're feeling towards their injury and how it's affecting other areas. And as I shared earlier, all of our participants struggled with academics, even though it seemed like they had more time, they had more on their plate emotionally. So I feel like once the academic staff understands that, just sharing with their support staff and other staff members the importance of listening, to identifying any signs that we see, and just sharing that in a training, whether they have trainings monthly with their support staff or twice a semester. I think it's important to point that out. Injuries in athletics is inevitable, so we need to be prepared to have that conversation. And those that spend the most time with our student athletes, we should want them to be well versed in that conversation too. So I would be happy to pass information on, and other information that I've seen from other presenters or staff members. I would, if you have that question for your academic staff, I would love to pass that information on to you.
And then our next question comes from Sam, and they asked, did you work at all with athletic trainers and other medical staff in your research or in your work?
No, I did not work with any athletic trainers for the specifics of my dissertation question. I just wanted to know the experience of the student athlete. So I had to listen to how they felt about the athletic trainers or coaches from their own eyes. But in my current role, I see athletic trainers, but I don't currently work with them. I think what happens is we kind of play the game of telephone of someone's injured, someone's going to miss this, someone's going to do that. And then if we have that concern, going back to them of how can we help? Is there anything that needs to change? Should we go on Zoom? I think that those are the conversations of how can we best support that student from my area in academics with those that are injured. So no, I did not work with the athletic trainers. And currently I just try to work with them as much as I can if one of my student athletes is injured, just so I can know how to best support them in my area.
And then our next question comes from Natalie, and they're asking, do you have any recommendations for faculty and academic staff or with a student athlete where the impact of their injury is ongoing?
Yeah, I think my personal recommendation, just based on the research that I would do, is just a continual check-in and being able to ask the student athlete simply, what would be most helpful for you? What does that mean, that we need to have an alternative assignment? Does that mean that you cannot? There was a student that was injured that couldn't go to a service learning project that was 20% of the grade, but the faculty member understood and had that conversation and offered him something else. And I think that it just alleviates the stress that they feel for that course or for that class. So the recommendation I would have is just a continual checking in and being aware. And then a lot of times understanding that, I mean, we know this, but they don't have any control over these injuries. It might happen in practice. They might have missed a quiz that night, a test that night, because they're at the hospital, they're in treatment, like dealing with certain things. So just having that grace and understanding that, I think, is really important. And for that, you have to build those relationships with your students so they feel safe in sharing that. But I think that's the most thing that I've seen in academics, where something just happens and it's a domino effect, but the last thing they're thinking about a student athlete who's injured is, oh, I missed that test. Like they're thinking about all these other things in that moment. So I think it's just important to have that relationship so they feel more comfortable sharing, and that relationship with your academic staff so that they know that y'all are having this continual conversation of things that are going on. And again, like I said earlier, it's inevitable in almost all of our athletic sports. So it's going to happen. So making sure you're having that conversation and that relationship so that they can share who's injured, what's going on, and how we can continue to support them.
And then we have a comment from Kayla. She shared that her institution has an injured athlete support group. Oh. She also doesn't mind speaking on it as well. So she wants to unmute and share a little bit of that.
Yeah, I would love to hear.
Hey guys, thanks so much for having me on. I'm a student athlete services graduate assistant over here at Jacksonville University in Jacksonville, Florida. So yes, we do have an injured athlete support group in collaboration with SAC. I'm actually a facilitator for the group, so we meet bi-weekly, and some weeks we'll actually bring in a sports psychologist to discuss topics attributing to our injured athlete support group. So we talk about like embracing new roles, identity, retirement. So just that additional mental and emotional support for student athletes. And also I give the floor to them. So I let them discuss all they need to vent and communicate with me. And actually I take most of what we talk about and I relay on to our upper level staff. I communicated with the AD and just departmental staff and coaches to let them know what's going on and to help brainstorm ways in which we can create more of an inclusive environment for our injured athletes. Because as you listed with your research and such, it is such a hard transition in life. So yeah, that's something I wanted to share. Hopefully you could bring it on to your own institutions, but we've had great success with it so far. The participation has been a lot better than expected. And I think when you just give the floor to the athletes to talk and then communicate, you bring in a better showing, and it's definitely attracted a lot of attention for our department. So yeah, just wanted to share that. If you had any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I see the comments that's awesome. Love this idea, because I think that that's something very simple that's really impactful for them. Because like you said, the participation has been high, and you're giving them the floor to have this discussion. Doesn't get, I feel like right now we're all thinking about budgets, and that doesn't cost money. They're getting together, it's and something that's going to be really helpful for their process dealing with that. So I would love to hear more about that offline afterwards.
Yeah, I'd love to connect.
Well, I know we're at the end of our time, but I will give my information and I'll put it in the chat so that I can put up the QR codes for the evaluations. But if you have any more questions, I will love to answer them, love to connect. I'm at UGA again, so would love to chat more and connect more with people in the field. Also, thank you for spending your Friday afternoon with me, depending on where you are. Thank you, everyone. If you're logging out, I can't see everyone logging out, but thank you for thank you for coming. And again, I'll put these evaluations up here for the session and for the conference.